What is the ideal way to develop leadership? Every society provides its own answer to this question, and each, in groping for answers, defines its deepest concerns about the purposes, distributions, and uses of power. Business has contributed its answer to the leadership question by evolving a new breed called the manager. Simultaneously, business has established a new power ethic that favors collective over individual leadership, the cult of the group over that of personality. While ensuring the competence, control, and the balance of power among groups with the potential for rivalry, managerial leadership unfortunately does not necessarily ensure imagination, creativity, or ethical behavior in guiding the destinies of corporate enterprises. Leadership inevitably requires using power to influence the thoughts and actions of other people. Power in the hands of an individual entails human risks. First, the risk of equating power with the ability to get immediate results. Second, the risk of ignoring the many different ways people can legitimately accumulate power. And third, the risk of losing self-control in the desire for power. The need to hedge these risks accounts in part for the development of collective leadership and the managerial ethic. Consequently, an inherent conservatism dominates the culture of large organizations. In the Second American Revolution, John D. Rockefeller III describes the conservatism of organizations. An organization is a system, with a logic of its own, and all the weight of tradition and inertia. The deck is stacked in favor of the tried and proven way of doing things and against the taking of risks and striking out in new directions. Out of this conservatism and inertia, organizations provide succession to power through the development of managers rather than individual leaders. Ironically, this ethic fosters a bureaucratic culture in business, supposedly the last bastion protecting us from the encroachments and controls of bureaucracy in government and education. Manager versus leader personality. A managerial culture emphasizes rationality and control. Whether his or her energies are directed toward goals, resources, organization structures, or people, a manager is a problem solver. The manager asks, what problems have to be solved, and what are the best ways to achieve results so that people will continue to contribute to this organization? From this perspective, leadership is simply a practical effort to direct affairs, and to fulfill his or her task, a manager requires that many people operate efficiently at different levels of status and responsibility. It takes neither genius nor heroism to be a manager, but rather persistence, tough-mindedness, hard work, intelligence, analytical ability, and perhaps most important, tolerance and goodwill. Another conception of leadership, however, attaches almost mystical beliefs to what a leader is and assumes that only great people are worthy of the drama of power and politics. Here leadership is a psychodrama in which a brilliant, lonely person must gain control of himself or herself as a precondition for controlling others. Such an expectation of leadership contrasts sharply with the mundane, practical, and yet important conception that leadership is really managing work that other people do. 3 questions come to mind. Is this leadership mystique merely a holdover from our childhood, from a sense of dependency and a longing for good and heroic parents? Or is it true that no matter how competent managers are, their leadership stagnates because of their limitations in visualizing purposes and generating value in work? Driven by narrow purposes, without an imaginative capacity and the ability to communicate, do managers then perpetuate group conflicts instead of reforming them into broader desires and goals? If indeed problems demand greatness, then judging by past performance, the selection and development of leaders leave a great deal to chance. There are no known ways to train great leaders. Further, beyond what we leave to chance, there is a deeper issue in the relationship between the need for competent managers and the longing for great leaders. What it takes to ensure a supply of people who will assume practical responsibility may inhibit the development of great leaders. On the other hand, the presence of great leaders may undermine the development of managers who typically become very anxious in the relative disorder that leaders seem to generate. It is easy enough to dismiss the dilemma of training managers, though we may need new leaders or leaders at the expense of managers, by saying that the need is for people who can be both. But just as a managerial culture differs from the entrepreneurial culture that develops when leaders appear in organizations, managers and leaders are very different kinds of people. They differ in motivation, personal history, and in how they think and act. Attitudes toward goals. Managers tend to adopt impersonal, if not passive, attitudes toward goals. Managerial goals arise out of necessities rather than desires and, therefore, are deeply embedded in their organization's history and culture. Frederick G. Donner, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of General Motors from 1958 to 1967, expressed this kind of attitude toward goals in defining GM's position on product development. To meet the challenge of the marketplace, we must recognize changes in customer needs and desires far enough ahead to have the right products in the right places at the right time and in the right quantity. We must balance trends in preference against the many compromises that are necessary to make a final product that is both reliable and good-looking, that performs well and that sells at a competitive price in the necessary volume. We must design not just the cars we would like to build but, more important, the cars that our customers want to buy. Nowhere in this statement is there a notion that consumer tastes and preferences arise in part as a result of what manufacturers do. In reality, through product design, advertising, and promotion, consumers learn to like what they then say they need. Few would argue that people who enjoy taking snapshots need a camera that also develops pictures. But in response to a need for novelty, convenience, and a shorter interval between acting, snapping the picture, and gaining pleasure, seeing the shot, the Polaroid camera succeeded in the marketplace. It is inconceivable that Edwin Land responded to impressions of consumer need. Instead, he translated a technology, polarization of light, into a product, which proliferated and stimulated consumers' desires. The example of Polaroid and Land suggests how leaders think about goals. They are active instead of reactive, shaping ideas instead of responding to them. Leaders adopt a personal and active attitude toward goals. The influence a leader exerts in altering moods, evoking images and expectations, and in establishing specific desires and objectives determines the direction a business takes. The net result of this influence changes the way people think about what is desirable, possible, and necessary. Conceptions of work. Managers tend to view work as an enabling process involving some combination of people and ideas interacting to establish strategies and make decisions. They help the process along by calculating the interests in opposition, planning when controversial issues should surface, and reducing tensions. In this enabling process, managers' tactics appear flexible. On one hand, they negotiate and bargain. On the other, they use rewards, punishments, and other forms of coercion. Alfred P. Sloan's actions at General Motors illustrate how this process works in situations of conflict. The time was the early 1920s, when Ford Motor Company still dominated the automobile industry using, as did General Motors, the conventional water-cooled engine. With the full backing of Pierre DuPont, Charles Kettering dedicated himself to the design of an air-cooled copper engine, which, if successful, would be a great technical and marketing coup for GM. Kettering believed in his product, but the manufacturing division heads opposed the new design on two grounds. First, it was technically unreliable, and second, the corporation was putting all its eggs in one basket by investing in a new product instead of attending to the current marketing situation. Read more about 3 differences between managers and leaders. In the summer of 1923, after a series of false starts and after its decision to recall the copper engine Chevrolets from dealers and customers, GM management scrapped the project. When it dawned on Kettering that the company had rejected the engine, he was deeply discouraged and wrote to Sloan that, without the organized resistance against the project, it would have succeeded and that, unless the project were saved, he would leave the company. Alfred Sloan was all too aware that Kettering was unhappy and indeed intended to leave General Motors. Sloan was also aware that, while the manufacturing division strongly opposed the new engine, Pierre DuPont supported Kettering. Further, Sloan had himself gone on record in a letter to Kettering less than 2 years earlier expressing full confidence in him. The problem Sloan had was how to make his decision stick, keep Kettering in the organization. He was much too valuable to lose, avoid alienating DuPont, and encourage the division heads to continue developing product lines using conventional water-cooled engines. Sloan's actions in the face of this conflict reveal much about how managers work. First, he tried to reassure Kettering by presenting the problem in a very ambiguous fashion, suggesting that he and the executive committee sided with Kettering, but that it would not be practical to force the divisions to do what they were opposed to. He presented the problem as being a question of the people, not the product. Second, he proposed to reorganize around the problem by consolidating all functions in a new division that would be responsible for the design, production, and marketing of the new engine. This solution appeared as ambiguous as his efforts to placate Kettering. Sloan wrote, "My plan was to create an independent pilot operation under the sole jurisdiction of Mr. Kettering, a kind of copper-cooled car division. Mr. Kettering would designate his own chief engineer and his production staff to solve the technical problems of manufacture." Sloan did not discuss the practical value of this solution, which included saddling an inventor with management responsibility, but in effect, he used this plan to limit his conflict with Pierre DuPont. Essentially, the managerial solution that Sloan arranged limited the options available to others. The structural solution narrowed choices, even limiting emotional reactions to the point where the key people could do nothing but go along. It allowed Sloan to say in his memorandum to DuPont, "We have discussed the matter with Mr. Kettering at some length this morning, and he agrees with us absolutely on every point we made. He appears to receive the suggestion enthusiastically and has every confidence that it can be put across along these lines." Sloan placated people who opposed his views by developing a structural solution that appeared to give something but in reality only limited options. He could then authorize the car division's general manager, with whom he basically agreed, to move quickly in designing water-cooled cars for the immediate market demand. Is the leadership mystique merely a holdover from our childhood, from a sense of dependency and a longing for good and heroic parents? Years later, Sloan wrote, evidently with tongue-in-cheek, "The copper-cooled car never came up again in a big way. It just died out. I don't know why." To get people to accept solutions to problems, managers continually need to coordinate and balance opposing views. Interestingly enough, this type of work has much in common with what diplomats and mediators do, with Henry Kissinger apparently an outstanding practitioner. Managers aim to shift balances of power toward solutions acceptable as compromises among conflicting values. Leaders work in the opposite direction. Where managers act to limit choices, leaders develop fresh approaches to long-standing problems and open issues to new options. To be effective, leaders must project their ideas onto images that excite people and only then develop choices that give those images substance. John F. Kennedy's brief presidency shows both the strengths and weaknesses connected with the excitement leaders generate in their work. In his inaugural address he said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." This much-quoted statement forced people to react beyond immediate concerns and to identify with Kennedy and with important shared ideals. On closer scrutiny, however, the statement is absurd because it promises a position, which, if adopted, as in the Vietnam War, could produce disastrous results. Yet unless expectations are aroused and mobilized, with all the dangers of frustration inherent in heightened desire, new thinking and new choice can never come to light. Leaders work from high-risk positions. Indeed, they are often temperamentally disposed to seek out risk and danger, especially where the chance of opportunity and reward appears promising. From my observations, the reason one individual seeks risks while another approaches problems conservatively depends more on his or her personality and less on conscious choice. For those who become managers, a survival instinct dominates the need for risk, and with that instinct comes an ability to tolerate mundane, practical work. Leaders sometimes react to mundane work as to an affliction. Relations with others. Managers prefer to work with people. They avoid solitary activity because it makes them anxious. Several years ago, I directed studies on the psychological aspects of careers. The need to seek out others with whom to work and collaborate seemed to stand out as an important characteristic of managers. When asked, for example, to write imaginative stories in response to a picture showing a single figure, a boy contemplating a violin or a man silhouetted in a state of reflection, managers populated their stories with people. The following is an example of a manager's imaginative story about the young boy contemplating a violin. Mom and Dad insisted that their son take music lessons so that someday he can become a concert musician. His instrument was ordered and had just arrived. The boy is weighing the alternatives of playing football with the other kids or playing with the squeak box. He can't understand how his parents could think a violin is better than a touchdown. After 4 months of practicing the violin, the boy has had more than enough. Dad is going out of his mind, and Mom is willing to give in reluctantly to their wishes. Football season is now over, but a good third baseman will take the field next spring. This story illustrates 2 themes that clarify managerial attitudes toward human relations. The first, as I have suggested, is to seek out activity with other people, that is, the football team, and the second is to maintain a low level of emotional involvement in those relationships. Low emotional involvement appears in the writer's use of conventional metaphors, even clichés, and in the depiction of the ready transformation of potential conflict into harmonious decisions. In this case, the boy, Mom, and Dad agree to give up the violin for sports. These 2 themes may seem paradoxical, but their coexistence supports what a manager does, including reconciling differences, seeking compromises, and establishing a balance of power. The story further demonstrates that managers may lack empathy, or the capacity to sense intuitively the thoughts and feelings of others. Consider another story written to the same stimulus picture by someone thought of as a leader by his peers. This little boy has the appearance of being a sincere artist, one who is deeply affected by the violin, and has an intense desire to master the instrument. He seems to have just completed his normal practice session and appears to be somewhat crestfallen at his inability to produce the sounds that he is sure lie within the violin. He appears to be in the process of making a vow to himself to expend the necessary time and effort to play this instrument until he satisfies himself that he is able to bring forth the qualities of music that he feels within himself. With this type of determination and carry-through, this boy became one of the great violinists of his day. Empathy is not simply a matter of paying attention to other people. It is also the capacity to take in emotional signals and make them meaningful in a relationship. People who describe another person as deeply affected, with intense desire, crestfallen, and as one who can vow to himself, would seem to have an inner perceptiveness that they can use in their relationships with others. Managers relate to people based on their role in a series of events or a decision-making process, whereas leaders, who are interested in ideas, relate in more intuitive and empathetic ways. The difference is simply between a manager's focus on how things are done and a leader's focus on what events and decisions mean to participants. Managers have recently adopted the idea from game theory that decision-making events can be one of two types: win-lose situations, or zero-sum games, or win-win situations, in which everyone in the action comes out ahead. Managers strive to turn win-lose situations into win-win situations as part of the process of reconciling interpersonal differences and maintaining power balances. Survival instinct overrides the need for risk in those who become managers, and with that instinct comes the ability to tolerate mundane, practical work. Consider the decision of allocating capital resources among operating divisions in a large, decentralized organization. On the surface, the amount of money available for distribution at any given time is limited. As a result, the more one division receives, the less is available for other divisions. Managers often see this situation, as it affects human relations, as a conversion problem. How to turn what appears to be a win-lose situation into a win-win situation. Several solutions come to mind from that standpoint. First, the manager directs the attention of others toward procedure rather than substance. Here, the players become preoccupied with how to make decisions rather than what decisions to make. Once committed to the larger problem, these individuals must support the outcome because they were involved in developing the decision-making rules. They will accept current losses because they believe in the rules they devised, confident that they will win the next time. Second, the manager communicates with subordinates through signals rather than messages. A signal has several implicit positions, whereas a message explicitly states a position. Signals are inconclusive and open to reinterpretation if people become upset or angry. Messages carry the direct consequence that some people will not like what they hear. The nature of the messages elicits an emotional response and causes managers anxiety. The question of who wins and who loses is frequently obscured by signals. Third, the manager attempts to buy time. Managers appear to recognize that as time passes and major decisions are postponed, compromises emerge that take the sting out of win-lose situations, and the original game is superseded by new situations. Compromises imply that one can win and lose at the same time, depending on which game is being evaluated. There are undoubtedly many other tactical moves that managers employ to shift human situations from a win-lose to a win-win situation. However, the point is that such tactics are focused on the decision-making process itself, which is of interest to managers rather than leaders. Tactical interests have both costs and benefits. They make organizations fatter in bureaucratic and political intrigue and leaner in direct, hard work and warm human relationships. As a result, subordinates frequently describe managers as inscrutable, detached, and manipulative. These adjectives stem from subordinates' perceptions of being linked together in a process whose goal is to maintain a controlled, rational, and equitable structure. In contrast, leaders are frequently referred to with emotional adjectives. Leaders elicit strong feelings of identity and difference, as well as love and hatred. Human relationships in leader-dominated structures are frequently turbulent, intense, and even disorganized. Such an environment heightens individual motivation and frequently results in unexpected outcomes. Senses of self in religious experience varieties. William James distinguishes two types of personalities: once born and twice born. People with the former personality type have found it easier to adjust to life and have lived in a more or less peaceful flow since birth. Twice-borns, on the other hand, have had a difficult time. Their lives are defined by a constant struggle to achieve some sense of order. They cannot take things for granted, unlike once-borns. These people, according to James, have very different worldviews. For a once-born personality, the sense of self as a guide to behavior and attitude stems from a sense of belonging and harmony with one's surroundings. A sense of self stems from a profound sense of separateness for a twice-born. A sense of belonging or segregation has practical implications for the types of investments managers and leaders make in their careers. Managers see themselves as guardians and enforcers of an existing order of things with which they personally identify and from which they benefit. The perpetuation and strengthening of existing institutions increases a manager's sense of self-worth. He or she is performing in a role that aligns with ideals of duty and responsibility. In defining a once-born personality, William James had this harmony in mind. This sense of self as flowing easily to and from the outside world. Leaders are often twice-born personalities who feel disconnected from their surroundings. They may work for organizations, but they are never a part of them. Memberships, work roles, or other social indicators of identity have no bearing on their sense of self. And that sense of identity may serve as the theoretical foundation for explaining why some people seek out opportunities for change. Change may be brought about through technological, political, or ideological means, but the goal remains the same: to profoundly alter human, economic, and political relationships. When considering the development of leadership, we must consider two distinct paths of life history's sad face. 1. Development through socialization, which prepares the individual to guide institutions and maintain the existing balance of social relations. And 2. Development through personal mastery, which drives an individual to strive for psychological and social change. The first line of development produces managerial talent, the second line produces leaders. Leadership education and development. Everyone's development begins with their family. Each person goes through the traumas of being separated from his or her parents, as well as the pain that comes with it. Similarly, all individuals face difficulties in developing self-regulation and self-control. However, for some, perhaps a majority, the fortunes of childhood provide sufficient gratifications and opportunities to find substitutes for rewards that are no longer available. Such people, known as once-borns, have moderate identifications with their parents and find a balance between what they expect and what they can achieve in life. But what if the agonies of separation are exacerbated by a combination of parental demands and individual needs to the point where a sense of isolation, specialness, or wariness disrupts the bonds that bind children to their parents and other authority figures? Given such circumstances, a person becomes deeply involved in his or her inner world at the expense of interest in the outer world. Self-esteem for such a person is no longer solely dependent on positive attachments and tangible rewards. Expectations of performance and achievement, as well as the desire to do great things, all contribute to a sense of self-reliance. Such self-perceptions are meaningless if the individual's talents are insignificant. Even with exceptional talent, there is no guarantee of success, let alone that the outcome will be positive rather than negative. Other factors play a role in development as well. For one thing, leaders, like artists and other gifted people, frequently struggle with neuroses. Their ability to function varies significantly even in the short run, and some potential leaders give up entirely. Furthermore, development patterns that affect managers and leaders extend beyond early childhood and include the selective influence of specific people. Managerial personalities form attachments that are moderate and widely distributed. Leaders, on the other hand, form and break off intense one-on-one relationships. It is a well-known fact that people with exceptional abilities are frequently disinterested students. Nobody, for example, could have predicted Einstein's great achievements based on his mediocre academic record. The cause of mediocrity is clearly not a lack of ability. It could instead be the result of self-absorption and an inability to pay attention to the mundane tasks at hand. The only sure way for a gifted person to break free from reverie-like preoccupation and self-absorption is to form a deep attachment to a great teacher or other person who understands and can communicate with the gifted individual. The availability of teachers, possibly parental surrogates, whose strengths lie in cultivating talent determines whether gifted individuals find what they need in one-on-one relationships. Fortunately, when generations collide and self-selection takes place, we learn more about how to develop leaders and how talented people from different generations influence one another. People who form important one-on-one apprenticeship relationships can often accelerate and intensify their development, even if they appear to be destined for mediocre careers. An individual's psychological readiness to benefit from such a relationship is determined by a life experience that forces that person to turn inward. Consider Dwight Eisenhower, whose early military career revealed little about his future development. While some of his West Point classmates were already experiencing the war firsthand in France during World War I, Eisenhower felt embedded in the monotony and unsought safety of the zone of the interior. That was intolerable punishment. Shortly after World War I, Eisenhower, a young officer with doubts about his future, requested a transfer to Panama to work under General Fox Connor, a senior officer he admired. His request was denied by the Army. This setback was fresh in Eisenhower's mind when his firstborn son, Ike, died of influenza. The Army then transferred Eisenhower to Panama, where he took up his duties under General Connor, with the shadow of his lost son very much upon him. Eisenhower reverted to being the son he had lost in a relationship with the kind of father he would have wanted to be. In this tense situation, he began to learn from his teacher. General Connor offered, and Eisenhower gladly accepted, a magnificent military tutorial. The effects of this relationship on Eisenhower cannot be quantified, but its impact on his career path from that point cannot be overstated. Life with General Connor was a sort of graduate school in military affairs and the humanities, leavened by a man who was experienced in his knowledge of men and their conduct. Eisenhower later wrote about Connor. "I will never be able to adequately express my gratitude to this one gentleman. He is the one more or less invisible figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt in a lifetime of association with great and good men." Eisenhower's breakthrough occurred some time after his tour of duty with General Connor. He was assigned to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, one of the Army's most competitive schools. It was a sought-after position, and Eisenhower took advantage of it. Unlike in high school and West Point, his performance at the command school was outstanding. He graduated first in his class. Psychological biographies of gifted individuals repeatedly demonstrate the critical role that a teacher plays in the development of an individual. Thomas A. Scott, Andrew Carnegie's senior, owed him a lot. Scott, as head of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division, recognized talent and a desire to learn in the young telegrapher assigned to him. Scott increased Carnegie's self-confidence and sense of accomplishment by giving him increasing responsibility and the opportunity to learn through close personal observation. Scott did not fear Carnegie's aggressiveness because of his own personal strength and achievement. Rather, he made full use of it in encouraging Carnegie's initiative. Great teachers take chances. They initially bet on talent they see in younger people. Working closely with their juniors also puts them at risk of emotional involvement. Risks do not always pay off, but willingness to take them appears to be critical in the development of leaders. Can organizations train leaders? A myth about how people learn and develop that appears to have taken root in American culture now dominates business thinking. It is a common misconception that people learn best from their peers. Because of the tendency for mutual identification and social restraints on authoritarian behavior among equals, the threat of evaluation and even humiliation is said to recede in peer relationships. Peer training takes many forms in organizations. The use of task forces comprised of peers from various interested occupational groups, sales, production, research, and finance, for example, ostensibly removes the constraints of authority on an individual's willingness to assert and exchange ideas. As a result, the theory goes, people interact more freely, listen to criticism and other points of view more objectively, and, finally, learn from this healthy exchange. Another application of peer training can be found in some large corporations, such as Philips NV in the Netherlands, where the organizational structure is based on the principle of joint responsibility of two peers, one representing the commercial side of the business and the other the technical. Formally, both share equal responsibility for geographic operations or product groups, depending on the case. In practice, it is possible that one of the peers will come to dominate the management. Nonetheless, the primary interaction takes place between two or more equals. Leaders frequently feel disconnected from their surroundings. They may work for organizations, but they are never a part of them. The main question I have about such arrangements is whether they perpetuate the managerial orientation and prevent one-on-one relationships between senior people and potential leaders from forming. Aware of the potential stifling effects of peer relationships on aggressiveness and individual initiative, another company, much smaller than Philips, uses peer-to-peer joint responsibility for operating units, with one key difference. The CEO of this company encourages competition and rivalry among peers, ultimately rewarding the winner with increased responsibility. unintended consequences of these hybrid arrangements can be disastrous. There is no simple way to limit competition. Instead, it pervades all levels of the operation, allowing cliques to form in an atmosphere of intrigue. One large integrated oil company has recognized the value of developing leaders through direct influence of senior executives on junior executives. The chairman and CEO selects one talented university graduate to be his special assistant and with whom he will work closely for a year on a regular basis. The junior executive becomes available for assignment to one of the operating divisions at the end of the year, where he or she will be assigned to a responsible position rather than a training position. This apprenticeship familiarizes the junior executive with the use of power as well as the critical antidotes to the power disease known as hubris, performance and integrity. Working in one-on-one relationships, where there is a formal and recognized difference in power between the players, necessitates a high level of emotional tolerance. This interchange, which is unavoidable in close working relationships, accounts for many executives' reluctance to become involved in such relationships. Fortune published an interesting story about the departure of a key executive, John W. Hanley, from Procter & Gamble's top management to the position of Chief Executive Officer at Monsanto. According to this account, P&G's CEO and chairman passed Hanley up for the presidency, instead naming another executive vice president to the position. The chairman clearly felt he couldn't work well with Hanley, who, according to his own admission, was aggressive, eager to experiment and change practices, and constantly challenged his superior. A chief executive officer has the right to choose people with whom he is comfortable. However, I wonder if senior offices' increased ability to tolerate their subordinates' competitive impulses and behavior is beneficial to corporations. At the very least, a greater tolerance for interchange would not favor the managerial team player over the individual who could become a leader. I am constantly surprised by how frequently chief executives feel threatened by open challenges to their ideas, as if the source of their authority was at stake rather than their specific ideas. In one case, a chief executive officer who was troubled by the aggressiveness and, at times, outright rudeness of one of his talented vice presidents used various indirect methods to avoid dealing with his subordinate, such as group meetings and hints from outside directors. I advised the executive to confront the source of his annoyance. I proposed that by confronting him directly, he and his subordinate would learn to validate the distinction between the authority to be preserved and the issues to be debated. The ability to confront implies the ability to tolerate aggressive interaction. And that skill not only removes the veils of ambiguity and signaling that are so common in managerial cultures, but it also fosters the emotional relationships that leaders require in order to survive. Like, subscribe, get notified.